in the post-classical period, so that's period 3 in AP World History. So we left off talking about some political structures, and I want to continue this video by talking about how the spread of Islam is going to impact trade networks. So this map is pretty indicative of the extent of the trade networks that we see in Africa as well as Eurasia. But I want to elaborate on what a lot of this means. So first off, before Islam is founded, most African societies, especially the sub-Saharan ones, are so focused on their kinship networks that they don't trade on a global level. But again, that is before Islam is founded. And that's not exclusive. We do, of course, have Bedouin traders from Mecca and Medina who are going all around the Sahara region prior to the founding of Islam. And we also have some trade along the East African coast, although that declined significantly after the fall of Rome and the fall of the Han dynasty, as well as the fall of the Gupta dynasty in India. So the end of some of those great period 2 empires does lead to a decline in trade. But what we see is that when Islam starts to spread, that really represents a revival of these global trade networks. So as time goes on, sub-Saharan Africa increasingly trades with other parts of the world, and at the same time, it learns about the teachings of Islam. So there are two major trade networks we need to focus on. There's the land-based trade network along the Sahara, so we can see a variety of trade networks, and we will zoom in on some of these regions in a little while later in this video. And so these are land trade routes, of course, and then we also have water trade routes along the Red Sea, the Arabian Sea, the Indian Ocean, the Persian Gulf, and of course through the Mediterranean and Black Sea as well. So by land and water, the African continent is essentially connected to all of Eurasia, and it has many valuable goods that cannot be found elsewhere in the world. And again, we'll elaborate on those soon. So what we see is that the trans-Saharan trade specifically increases noticeably with the arrival of Muslim merchants in the 7th and 8th centuries CE. So again, this is not very long after Islam is founded. We see that the trade across the Sahara Desert really noticeably increases. Most of the Sahara Desert was uninhabited prior to the spread of Islam. Even after the spread of Islam, it's a very dangerous place to occupy. So for the most part, we see that there, but we will talk about some exceptions later on. So one of the reasons why trade was possible, that is, across these arid climates is because of a very special animal, the camel. So many people associate the camel with the Sahara Desert, but it actually was not native to that region. Camels come from the Arabian Peninsula. So the Muslim world is also home to the camel. So why are camels the preferred method of transportation for desert trade? So camels, as I just said, are native to Arabia, and they are eventually brought to Africa by Muslim traders. And camels are accustomed already to living in harsh and dry climates, so they naturally adapt well to living in the Sahara. Camels can consume a very large quantity of water at one time. I thought this was crazy, but I read it in a couple of different places that camels can actually consume over 50 gallons of water in about 3 minutes. And then after that, they don't need to drink water for a very long stretch of time. So essentially, as we know, they store water in their humps, and this can last a very noticeable amount of time, allowing them to travel very vast distances without having to stop for water. So because of their water consumption, camels replace horses and donkeys. And after 300 CE, they are really the exclusive method of travel for desert trading networks. And one of the forms of technology that then develops that actually makes camels even more efficient is different types of saddles. So we can see a few here on this illustration to the right. And I want to explain how actually the type of saddle varies based on where the traders are from. So the traders from the South Arabian Peninsula have saddles where the rider sits behind the camel's hump. Well, let's go with the camel that has one hump here. So the saddle actually sits behind the hump, and the reason why that is so that the rider can hold on to the hump as well as the hair on the hump for greater control. If you're from northern Arabia, the saddle actually had the rider sit right on top of the camel's hump. And the reason for that was that the rider would have greater visibility, and this was good for defense. In northern Africa, saddles were created so that the rider sat in front of the hump. And this was very good also for the rider to have control over the camel, very close to the camel's head. And the Eastern African trader, so from present-day Somalia, designed a saddle that actually exclusively carried loads of cargo and no people. So nonetheless, we actually see how this technology develops to adapt to the camel and how it actually is different based on the interests and really based on the strategy of the traders. So what did this trans-Saharan trade have to offer? Well, the most significant natural resource that comes from Africa that was very difficult to find at that point elsewhere was gold. Gold comes from Western Africa, but this this little curve in the West African coast, for lack of a better word. In fact, this coast is actually nicknamed the Gold Coast and also the Ivory Coast. So you can, of course, infer from that what kind of natural resources come from there. And because of these natural resources, the Trans-Saharan Trade Network becomes famous throughout Europe and Asia. In fact, there was trade across the Sahara Desert back during the Roman Empire, and that was the main source of gold at that time. So gold is the most precious commodity that's coming from West Africa, but we also see that ivory is coming from that region, and they also trade slaves from that region, which eventually, in a complicated way, will lead to the transatlantic slave trade, but we won't talk about that yet. And also salt comes directly from the desert region, which was actually much harder to come by then than we think of today. We tend to think, oh, there's salt at every table at a diner, right? But it was actually very difficult to come across. So it was a valuable commodity from places outside of the desert regions. So the trade across the Sahara Desert brings considerable wealth to West Africa. And in the instances when there is a more centralized government in this region, so during the kingdoms of Ghana and Mali, which we'll talk about in a minute, this brings so much wealth to the region that these kingdoms become very strong, centralized, wealthy, and famous worldwide. So there's also the Indian trade network that we should be familiar with. So as we already are familiar with, India is also a very prime-time trade destination. They're really the only producers and cultivators of cotton in the known world at this point. And one of their, in addition, of course, to the Far East, to China, one of the major trade destinations was the east coast of Africa, what we call the Swahili city-states. And I'll talk about Swahili in a little while later in this video. But nonetheless, the Indian Ocean Trade Network is particularly interested in this time in trading with these coastal cities like Kilwa, which is one of the most famous of the East African city-states. That's in modern Tanzania. Malindi, which is farther north, that's in present-day Kenya, as well as Mogadishu, which is in present-day Somalia. So that's actually it's not on this map, my apologies, but Mogadishu is farther north, but these are some of the largest of these Swahili city-states. And they actually, before this more global trade network, all these city-states traded with themselves. And these trade networks are evident as far back as around 2000 BCE. So we see that there's a very ancient tradition of trading considerable distances in the Bantu-speaking world. Before Islam is founded, Africa is already connected to India, Southeast Asia, Greece, Rome, and Persia by trade. So as Islam spreads, that's another reason for all these global connections. So by no means should we think that these areas were unheard of far away before Islam was founded. By the 8th century CE, maritime trade is rejuvenated by Africans. For a while, water trade networks declined. This is after the fall of Rome, the fall of the Han Dynasty, and the fall of the Gupta Empire in India. You don't see that much trade by water after those empires decline, but again, by about 800 CE, these trade networks revive. And that's when we see the Swahili city-states really proliferate. In fact, I should correct myself. Before Islam, of course, these were not Swahili-speaking regions. They only spoke Bantu languages. And I'll explain what I mean by that in a little while. But in any case, these Swahili city-states, these areas here, sell things like ivory, gold, and slaves to Arab trading partners. And that's significant in itself because gold does not come from this part of Africa. So we can infer then that they are trading gold from places in West Africa to the Swahili city-states, and from there they travel to farther east destinations. So that's a very significant distance that these goods are traveling. Also, the East African coastal city-states sell very exotic goods, things like tortoise shells, peacock feathers, and rhino horns. And in exchange, the Swahili areas purchase very precious goods that come from very far abroad. So we have archaeological evidence that shows that the Swahili city-states purchased things like porcelain that came all the way from China, cotton that came all the way from India, as well as manufactured ironwork, which also came from farther abroad. Chinese porcelain is still commonly found in Swahili ruins, and that shows again the abundance of trade with places as far away as China in the post-classical period. So this is after the Han Dynasty fell. They're still trading a very, very long distance. And the Swahili city-states are very wealthy, and this is apparent even though many of these places don't exist as large empires anymore. We see that through archaeological records how wealthy they were. So one of the best indicators of that was the material that they used to build their major infrastructure projects. So they used stone, which may not seem like a big deal to us, but stone was something that didn't always come from the region, and it cost more than mud or clay, which was much more common to build structures with. And stone, of course, lasts much longer than clay structures, so many of them still stand today. So let's talk about some of the major kingdoms that exist in sub-Saharan Africa in the post-classical period. So this map gives us a sense of many of the regions that start to centralize around this time. We're first going to turn our attention to West Africa. We're going to talk about the kingdoms of Ghana and later Mali. You notice that they overlap. That's on purpose because Ghana and Mali did not exist at the same time. What used to be Ghana eventually will become Mali. And then Songhai, but that happens later, so we won't talk about that in this period. We'll talk a little bit as well about East Africa, specifically the Kingdom of Ethiopia. We're also going to talk about the Kingdom of Zimbabwe, and then we'll elaborate on the Swahili city-states, which we already mentioned previously. So, let's talk about Ghana first. So Ghana is situated, as we can see here, between the Sahara Desert to the north and the tropical rainforests of the West African coast, which are along the Niger River. So if you're familiar with modern African political borders, you might know that this is not actually where the country of Ghana exists. Ghana is actually located farther south. But nonetheless, this is where ancient Ghana was located. So it was believed to have been founded in the 5th century CE, so that's about 2 centuries before Muhammad's lifetime, which again suggests to us that this was a kingdom that was already on the rise before Islam reached that place. It reached its peak between the 8th and 11th centuries CE. It became wealthy due to its gold and ivory trade, and this was a very profitable item that Muslim traders wanted, and they often exchanged these precious goods for things like salt that came from the Sahara region. They would trade things like copper, cloth from India, as well as tools. The capital city of the Kingdom of Ghana was Kumbai-Saleh, which we see located right there in the center, and it had a centralized government, but it was aided by nobles. So we do have a king, but we also have very powerful nobles who have strong positions of power in government. So it's a quasi-monarchy / oligarchy. And they have a very strong army, which was equipped with iron weapons. So we know that their military technology was strong for its time. So eventually, the Kingdom of Ghana is going to decline, and it will be replaced by the Kingdom of Mali, which exists in the same region, albeit Mali is actually larger than Ghana. That's actually isn't the best image. When I dragged it around, some of the labels got shifted over, so I want to show you this. So Mali actually is larger in size than Ghana, and it stretches to the Atlantic Ocean. So actually, if I were to redo this, I'd make this green circle about that big. But in any case, Mali is going to rise after the Kingdom of Ghana declines. Ghana becomes weak through war, and by the 12th century, it's essentially no longer in existence. And when Mali rises, it becomes more prosperous than Ghana had ever been. In similar ways to Ghana, Mali became wealthy because of its gold trade, but they also gain wealth because they tax nearly all traded goods that are entering West Africa. And they use one major city in particular to do this, the city of Timbuktu. So Timbuktu is located just before we reach the Sahara Desert. So I like to think of it, if any of you have ever gone on a long road trip, particularly if you've driven through a desert. Like I drove through Arizona once, and I remember seeing all these signs that said last gas station for 100 miles, things like that. And they meant it. After you pass that last gas station, if you haven't filled up, you're out of luck, right? So I'd like to think about Timbuktu as sort of the last stop before no man's land, right? So Timbuktu is a city that pretty much every trans-Saharan trade network must pass through in order to get to their final destination. So Timbuktu is used as this tax base, right? And all the revenue from these taxes goes to the Kingdom of Mali and makes it become incredibly wealthy. So, most residents, though, were not traders. They were farmers. They farmed sorghum and rice, which were both good sources of carbohydrates, so they helped the population increase. And as I said earlier, Timbuktu is a very wealthy city. And in addition to that, the city of Gao, which is not labeled here, G-A-O, it's spelled, it's located along the Niger River, south of Timbuktu. So those two cities accumulate the most wealth in the Kingdom of Mali. And as time goes on, they use that wealth to proliferate culture throughout the empire. So you see universities crop up in these two cities. You see religious schools crop up in these places as Islam starts to spread to the region. And by the 1500s CE, the books that were created and sold in Timbuktu actually were worth more money than any other traded item at the time. So I really want us to realize how big of a deal that is. That books actually could sell for more than something like gold. So that gives you a sense of how important knowledge was as a commodity. And like we said with, let's say, the ancient Hellenistic world with the great library in Alexandria, when knowledge becomes a commodity, you know that an empire is in a golden age because they are bursting with culture, right? So again, in period 3, we tend to think of places like Europe plummeting into the Dark Ages. This certainly is not the case for Mali. All right, so let's talk about two very important leaders of the Kingdom of Mali. Let's talk first about the founder, Sundiata. So Sundiata, his father, ruled a small society in West Africa in modern Guinea. And after his father dies, Sundiata ends up coming to power despite the fact that A, he had a physical disability, and B, he was competing with other people who wanted to succeed his father. So the fact that he overcame these difficulties gives him the nickname the Lion Prince. Now, there's a belief that he was Muslim, although his successor, that we'll talk about in a moment, Musa, tends to get the credit for bringing Islam to the region. But nonetheless, if Sundiata was Muslim, he used his connections with others of the same faith to establish trade relationships with North African and Arab merchants. So Mali is already rich before Mansa Musa comes to rule. And by the time of Sundiata's death, there was already a thriving gold trade in the Kingdom of Mali. And then we have the most famous of all the Mali kings, Mansa Musa. So he was Sundiata's grandnephew, and he was Muslim. And in 1324, he goes on his pilgrimage to Mecca. But he doesn't go single-handed. He ends up taking an extraordinary caravan with him. He takes about 100 camels. He takes thousands of slaves. He has an army of soldiers. He takes gold with him. And every time he stops somewhere, he rewards the people who host him with things like gold and slaves and camels, right? So what he's doing is not only going on a religious journey, but also displaying the wealth of Mali to the outside world. When he returns from Mecca, he has a deepened devotion to Islam, and he starts to establish religious schools in the city of Timbuktu, and also builds mosques in other Muslim trading cities. So one of the things we need to remember is that in the early years of Islam, it was not required for other citizens to convert to this new religion. So many people in West Africa held on to their traditional beliefs. Again, remember that proselytization or conversion was not required. One of the common practices that many hold on to is the concept of ancestor worship. Mali ends up declining in the 1400s CE, but even though it falls, Islam at that point is a prominent religion in the region, and it's going to continue into the Songhai Empire, which we'll talk about in period 4, and this is still a very Muslim portion of the world today, so much continuity to acknowledge. Let's move south and talk about the Kingdom of Zimbabwe. This was the most powerful of all East African kingdoms between the 12th and 15th centuries. Location-wise, it's situated between Zambezi, as well as to the north, the Zambezi, and the Limpopo rivers in modern-day Zimbabwe and Mozambique. Okay, so these are those rivers here. The economy was very agriculturally based. And also many people grazed animals and also traded and mined for gold. So these regions oftentimes traded with outside networks such as the Swahili city-states, Persia, India, and China. And just like in Timbuktu, many goods that travel through the region of Zimbabwe have a tax placed on them, which allows Zimbabwe to profit. Just like we saw in other previous slides, right, like the Swahili city-states, we see that through the architecture, Zimbabwe was a very wealthy place. For example, they also use stone instead of clay to build structures. Zimbabwe itself is actually a Bantu word meaning dwelling. And the capital city of Zimbabwe, which we see here with this red dot, is called Great Zimbabwe. And this city had a very large wall around it. It was about 30 feet tall and 15 feet thick. And this wall still stands. And at the height of the Kingdom of Zimbabwe, by the late 1400s CE, there were thought to be about 20,000 residents living just in that city alone. So a significant population for its day. Let's talk a little bit about culture in the sub-Saharan region. So art, music, and storytelling are all very important concepts for us to identify with when we're thinking about the culture of this region. One of the reasons why we see art take the form that it does is because there's strong political and religious significance behind the art. I wanted to turn your attention to this head that's made out of bronze. It comes from Ile Ife, which is not labeled on this map, but it's located approximately here along the Niger River. So Ile Ife was known for their bronze work, a very expensive material, valuable material, and they oftentimes created sculptures of their past rulers. So this has a political significance as well as a religious one, because the traditional religions in many sub-Saharan African societies were based on ancestor worship. So the concept was that the modern people still looked to their deceased rulers for advice. We could also compare these in some ways to the busts of, let's say, ancient Greece. We know that it's quite common for people of political significance to be represented in sculpture. This too is occasionally, although it only shows the head and not the chest, this also is occasionally called a bust, so we could compare that to European art. Music is also very important. The music of sub-Saharan Africa has a distinctive rhythmic pattern, vocals interspersed with percussive elements such as hand claps, bells, pots, or gourds. And one form of music actually also translates into record keeping or history with the griot, a very important figure in sub-Saharan culture. So a griot is a storyteller. In some ways we could almost think of him like a bard in ancient Greece. What the griot would do would be he would communicate stories through music and poetry. The griot was said to have possessed encyclopedic knowledge of family trees and the lives and deeds of great leaders. And the griot was also very good at music, so he would sing stories and then accompany himself on instruments. And one of the most well-known instruments is the kora, which is a 12-string harp that we can see down here. The griots were venerated as well as feared because the thought was that they held the power of both language and story. So they weren't seen as gods by any means, but they were still seen as very important members of society. Kings actually oftentimes would seek the griot's counsel regarding political matters before they'd make a decision. And also, going back to the power of the griots, there was a saying that griots could sing your success or sing your downfall. One of the reasons why they were the history tellers was because most of these societies did not have a written language, not yet at least. So there was another saying that when a griot died, it was as though a library had burned. Also, there's a misconception that most griots were men. There were female griots, as we say, and they had very prominent roles in special ceremonies, such as weddings. A griot occasionally served as a counsel to a bride-to-be. The idea behind that was that they provided these women who were approaching marriage with a sense of empowerment in a society that was otherwise male-dominated. All right, 2 more slides left here. Let's talk about the language of Swahili. We previously talked about the Swahili city-states along the east coast of Africa, but we've not yet talked about the language that develops there. So Swahili is a very good example of syncretism. We've already discussed that with some items in period 2, but syncretism, I always like to think if you can remember the word sync, hopefully you can remember syncretism. The idea is that these are 2 different things that are combining together. It's almost like a hybrid of something. So, Swahili is just that. Swahili is a language that develops so that traders that are going in and out of East Africa can have a global language that they all can understand. So Swahili is a mix of Bantu as well as Arabic. This is still the main spoken language of 4 countries, or the official language rather, of 4 countries in Central and East Africa, including the Democratic Republic of the Congo, Kenya, Uganda, and Tanzania. And it's also one of the official languages of the African Union, which we'll talk about more in period 6. But this is a very, very important language that develops. It has a long-standing legacy, and it shows us an early example of these wide and impressive global exchange networks. All right, last but not least, let's talk about religion. Let's focus specifically on East Africa, although I did want to quickly draw your attention to this map of the entire continent to see what the religious makeup looks like. All right, so hopefully not surprisingly, the East African region, or rather the North and most of the West African region is Muslim, as well as some of the East African coast. So the reason why this is, we already discussed the trans-Saharan trade networks, and you might be less sure as to why East Africa also has a Muslim presence. But if we were to think about what's not on this map, this here is the Red Sea, and this is the Arabian Peninsula. So these areas are very close to the Muslim world. So Christianity actually had a stronghold in Africa before Islam starts to spread. It first enters through Egypt and then spreads to Ethiopia during the 1st century CE. But then again, as Islam spreads, that weakens the Christian influence in Ethiopia in a region specifically called Aksum, A-K-S-U-M. By the 12th century CE, the new ruling kingdom in Ethiopia called Lalibela, you can see the spelling here, enthusiastically embraces Christianity. And what they do is they order the building of these 11 different churches. All of them are made entirely out of rock, and they are underground, which I always thought was so cool. So this is actually the ground level. That's the church. So Ethiopia, especially Lalibela itself, is actually almost like this island, or I suppose peninsula, in a predominantly Muslim area that has maintained Christianity as its major religion. In between the 12th and 16th centuries, Ethiopia, as we just said, yeah, it's like an island of Christianity, right? But this Christianity is not the same as the Eastern Orthodox Church or the Roman Catholic Church. The Ethiopian Christians still develop their own unique identity. They combine many traditional elements into their religious practice, things like ancestor worship and belief in spirits, but they also worship Jesus. And of course, they use crosses in their architecture, as we can see here. So just like we said with Swahili in the previous slide, this form of Christianity could also be seen as a form of syncretism because, again, they are worshiping Christianity, or they are practicing Christianity, but they also include some more ancient practices, and of course they adopt their own method of being Christians, including very unique architecture here. These carved rock structures become a feature of Ethiopian religious architecture actually since the 2nd millennium BCE. So the use of rock as a construction material was not new in Ethiopia, but it becomes famous once we see these rock churches coming up. And that's it for this section. So we're finished talking about post-classical Africa in period 3. Stay tuned for the next segment, and thank you as always for watching, and I